Hey guys, welcome to Bible Time!
I wonder where Elmer is. He's probably eating candy or playing with his Matchbox cars. I hope he's not too much longer. Oh, you're always late, Elmer. We told Tommy we'd meet him after school.
Sorry, I didn't mean to be late.
Yeah, we're supposed to meet Tommy soon.
It's okay, we still have time to get to the library.
What were you doing anyway?
Well, I was talking to Joe.
Why would you talk to him? He's such a troublemaker.
Because I was sharing Jesus with him.
What? Are you kidding? Why would you do that?
Well, I had prayed to God to show me someone at school who needed to hear about him.
But sharing Jesus should only be done in church. That's what the pastor's for.
If we only do that, how would other people know about Jesus?
I don't know, but I know you're not a pastor.
Oh, I'm not a pastor, but the Bible says that we should go and tell everyone about him.
But what if someone gets mad and doesn't want to hear it?
Well, first you have to ask God to help you, because God wants to use you and me to reach other kids for him.
What would I say?
Pray to the Lord to give you the right words. The Lord promised to give us the words if we asked.
I don't know if I could do that. It's not easy to share Jesus with my friends.
You can. Just think about it. Get in and just do it.
Okay, I'm gonna pray that the Lord would lead me to someone and that he gives me what the right words to say are.
Good. I know that God has great plans for you and me.
Come on, let's get to the library and pray that someone there might need Jesus. And that Jesus will use us to share about him.
I hope Tommy is still there so we can share Jesus with him. Let's go.
Let's head out.
Hello kids! Ready to get your wiggles on out? We're gonna sing Have You Seen a Wigglworm? Smaller than a tiny germ. He's got a great big appetite, so follow the motions and let's go and sing Have You Seen a Wigglworm? Have you seen a wigglworm? Smaller than a tiny germ. He has got a great big appetite. Though he isn't very big, he eats more than anything. Always looking for someone to guide. Never wiggle, 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 never giggle, giggle, giggle. Better squash the wigglworm when you feel ears you squirm. In your church on Sunday, in your school on Monday, fight off the wigglworm. I was in my Sunday seat, sitting still and being sweet, when I saw him crawling on my shoe. Wigglworm, don't bother me, we'll have a catastrophe. Then I kicked him out of Sunday school. Never wiggle, 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 never giggle, giggle, giggle. Better squash the wigglworm when you feel ears to squirm. In your church on Sunday, in your school on Monday, fight off the wiggle, fight off the wiggle, fight, fight, fight the wigglworm.
We're going to sing This Is a Day That the Lord Has Made. We can truly rejoice in all that he's done. Those that sing This Is the Day. This is the day, this is the day that the Lord has made, that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it, and be glad in it. This is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. This is the day that the Lord has made. Now we're gonna change it up. The guys are gonna sing the first This Is the Day, and the girls are gonna sing the second This Is a. So here we go. This is the day that the Lord has made.
That the Lord has made.
We will rejoice and be glad in it.
And be glad in
So everyone,
This is the day that the Lord has made.
we will rejoice and be glad in it. This is the day
This is the day
that the Lord has made.
Hello, boys and girls. Welcome back this week. Remember, we're telling a story about Gladys Aylward, a missionary to China, a young, teeny tiny little lady who God trained in real life, and then she raised money and went to she was traveling to China last time we were talking. She was on her way to the country that she felt God wanted her in, where she would tell people about Jesus and minister there for the rest of her life. So if you remember, she was in Vladivostok, a Russian city, and she was staying in a hotel, and the clerk had taken her passport and he wouldn't give it back. But in God's timing and with his protection, he came to her room that night and showed her her passport, and she was able to grab it really fast and tell him to leave her alone. But then she was in her room with her passport, and she was supposed to wait. Remember, the little girl told her, wait for the old man to come to your room and knock on the door. Well, she was pretty afraid, but she knew God was protecting her. And so she waited, and finally the man came to her door, knocked on her door, and he said, we have to go. And he took her outside. Remember, it's still winter. He took her outside with all of her things and her bangy pots. Hopefully they kept those from jiggling all over. And he took her to a Japanese ship that was in the harbor there. As she boarded, or as she tried to board the ship, some Russians caught up with her, and they grabbed her and they weren't going to let her go. They wanted to take her. They wanted to make her stay there in Russia and work as a slave person for them. And so she was wrestling with them and fighting them, and she didn't want to go with them. And then she remembered the £1 note that the Dutch people had given her on the train. Do you remember? They gave her a £1 note, which in our dollars is worth like 75 cents, but that was a lot of money back then. She remembered it. She reached in her pocket and she grabbed the note and she threw it. And as they all ran for the money, she ran for the ship and finally made it up on the ship. Oh, that old man had saved her life. She never knew who he was or why he was there, but God had sent him to save her life. When she got on the ship, she noticed that her passport had been changed when the clerk had it. They had changed her occupation from missionary to machinist. And people who could work with machines were kidnapped in Russia and kept there forever. No one would have ever known what happened to her. She realized the clerk's trickery, and she realized that God had protected her again. So she got on the ship, and it went to Japan. And then after she took another train ride down to the south side of Japan, she was able to take another boat to China. And at last, she arrived in China. She said when she got there, when she was a little girl, she'd always wanted to be blonde and tall. But when she got off the ship with all the Chinese people around her, she noticed that they were all dark-haired and all very tiny people. Didn't God prepare her even physically to work with this people? She looked like them. China is a very, very big country though, and Mrs. Jeannie Lawson was the missionary wife that she was going to go work with. Her husband had died and she'd been alone for a few years, but Gladys had written ahead and Mrs. Lawson was expecting her. So as she got in to the port, Mrs. Lawson had sent Mr. Liu to get her and take her to Mrs. Lawson. They had a 10-day trip ahead of them to get to where Mrs. Lawson was. They went by train and bus and mule wagon. So there were lots of mules that moved stuff. Like we have trains and semi-trucks nowadays. They had mule trains that they would pack up, and all these mules would move stuff where it needed to be. Well, part of the time they were with a mule train and riding in a wagon. And finally, after they crossed several mountain ranges and many rivers, after they slept in different places, sometimes outside, sometimes at little mission houses along the way, she met a woman along the way named Mrs. Smith. And Mrs. Smith gave her some clothes that looked like the Chinese women. It was a quilted jacket and quilted pants to keep you warm. And since this is what all the Chinese women wore, she said, we try to dress like them. And because their dress is more practical for the kind of work you have to do here, and it keeps you warm. She was very glad to take off her orange dress that she'd been wearing for 5 weeks up till this time. And she was able to clean up and feel refreshed. They left Mrs. Smith's house and finally made it to where Miss Jeannie Lawson was living. Mrs. Lawson had bought the Inn of Eight Happinesses in Yangcheng. It was an inn that was supposed to house travelers, and Gladys would help her build her business up so they had a way to support themselves as they served the Lord there in China. This was a place where people would stay and they would eat their dinner. They would rest their mules if they had mules, and then in the evening, Mrs. Lawson would tell stories about Jesus. The cook and Mrs. Lawson both spoke Chinese. So Gladys didn't speak any Chinese at this point. You remember the mission board said they weren't sure she could learn it. So she, instead of getting to listen to the stories about Jesus in Chinese, she was charged with taking care of the mules at night. She would feed them and water them and scrape the mud off their hooves. And she worked hard at this, even though she was a tiny woman. Matt's going to show you a picture now of the route she took, and you can see how far she had to go, all the way from France, all the way across to the other side of the continent, and then down to China, and then all the way inside till they finally made it to where Mrs. Lawson lives. There's a picture also of Gladys there when she was young and when she was first arriving in China. She looked very healthy and she was smiling, and she would learn to love this place called Yangcheng. This would be her home for the next 8 years. The local people, when she arrived, were still very suspicious of foreigners. So she was new and she had to prove that she was trustworthy. She was charged with getting the muleteers to stop. These are the people that had those long mule trains. So the cook taught her some words. She would stand out in the curb and say, "Come, come, come, nice place, no bugs, come, come, come." She would say it in Chinese, so obviously. And so she was learning some words. Sometimes, if they didn't turn and come to their inn, she would just grab the reins on the first mule. Remember, mules are pretty big. They're not little. They're big like a horse. She would grab the reins on the first mule, and she would just walk back to their inn, and they would go, because wherever the first mule went, the muleteers went, and all the mules afterwards. So she would get them business by pulling the mules into their house. She had great incentive to learn Chinese, though, because she didn't want to keep being the person who had to clean and feed the mules. The streets around the inn, someone went back a few years ago to see if they could find it, and there's a picture right now of what the streets or the alleys look like. There's just building after building after building in a very crowded city. And so the man who was looking for them asked some local people, and they said, "Oh, there is an inn that has an inscription on it that says it's the Jesus Alley." So he went back in there, and to the best of his ability, it seems that that's the place where Gladys and Mrs. Lawson lived. They had a door from the alley, which looks like it doesn't have a door on it, because you walk in from there and you go into the courtyard. And then all around the courtyard was a 2-story building that had rooms around the courtyard. And Mrs. Lawson lived in one place. I'm not sure if Gladys lived with her or if she had her own room, but they would want people to come and stay in all these rooms each night so that they could make a little bit of money and tell them about Jesus. When she wasn't working at the inn, though, she went to town and she would do her best to talk to people. She was listening and she was learning to speak Chinese. She was 30. They didn't think she could learn it, but she was learning. And at the end of the first year, she could speak decent Chinese. But also at the end of that first year, Mrs. Lawson got ill. As Gladys cared for her, she looked at her and said, "God, call you to my side, Gladys, in answer to my prayers. He wants you to carry on my work. He will provide, he will bless, and he will protect her." And then Mrs. Lawson died. That had to be scary for Gladys. She'd only been in this country for a year, but yet she'd had a year to learn the language, to learn some of the culture, because she'd been mixing with all these people for a year. And she took up the challenge to do what Mrs. Lawson had already started. She carried on her work. As her Chinese improved, she began to have regular services. She did house visits around the city, and she gave medical aid where she could. After Gladys died, though, they had less money because not Gladys, Mrs. Lawson. After Mrs. Lawson died, she was from a mission board and she had money that came to help support her. But when she died, that money stopped and Gladys wasn't sure how she would take care of herself. The inn didn't make enough money at that time to support her. So she was kind of in a quandary about what she would do. But about that time, the Chinese government decreed that it was going to be illegal to bind girls' feet anymore. So in China, when children were little, the girls were little, they would start, if this is your foot, your big toe would stay out, and then they would fold all the rest of your toes underneath, and they would make your foot this shape and this size or smaller as my hand. Can you imagine if your foot was that small? That would hurt. Every time it wants to grow, it can't grow because everything's tied up really tight. So China realized that was a bad practice. They told everyone that they should stop doing that. There was a local official called a mandarin that ran their city, and he came to Gladys because she was familiar with the city by now. She could speak some Chinese pretty well, and she already was going around offering medical aid, so people kind of looked up to her. He asked her if she would go to the homes and talk to people about why they shouldn't do this. He wanted to pay her, and he gave her soldiers to protect her when she traveled to these different places. Now she could take the gospel even farther in her city and outside of her city because the government was paying her to travel. Isn't that interesting? God works in all these neat ways. So she got to know this mandarin, this local leader. He was a man who was in charge of everything in the city. And one day, as she was talking to him about her concerns in the city, because he enjoyed hearing her, she would say, I see this is a problem, can we fix it? And if he could, he would. If he couldn't, then he would explain to her why he couldn't. And he came to trust her and her opinions. Well, one day, a riot started in the prison. Prisons that were very bad in those days. They were dirty, there was hardly any food, there was nothing for the men to do. And if you were there because you did a little bad thing or you were there because you murdered somebody, everybody was mixed together and equally miserable. So there was a riot and the prisoners took over the prison. Even the soldiers and the warden didn't want to go into the prison because it was so dangerous. So the mandarin came to little tiny Gladys and he said, you preach the living God everywhere. If you preach the truth, if your God protects you from harm, then you can stop this riot. Oh, can you imagine what she thought? She's going to have to go in the prison and stop those men from rioting and being awful. So she trusted God to take care of her, and she walked right in that prison. She took the axe away from the man who was hitting people with it, and she started ordering them around like she was a school teacher. And you know what? They obeyed. Must have been that Cockney voice. Afterwards, she found out that the conditions were very bad in this prison. They had no work, and I said before they didn't have any food. So she found them work to do, like weaving, and she spoke to many of them about the Lord. Some of them were saved. And after this time, the Chinese people, well, the men in the prison started, but the Chinese people gave her a nickname that they would call her the rest of her life, and that was Ai Weiwei, the virtuous one, or the honorable one, the one that we should look up to. And that was her nickname for time to come. I think there's a picture of the prison scene here. Looks pretty scary to me. I'm not sure I would be brave enough to walk into those scary men, but Gladys was, because she knew God was with her. So shortly after now, she applied for citizenship in China and she received it. She'd been there 4 years. She did her best to live like the Chinese, even learning to spit with great accuracy because women in China at that time spat. So she learned that little habit. She kept working for the magistrate, and the money that he gave her to travel and spread the gospel and make sure people weren't binding their feet really helped to support her. Although she loved China and her people, she did pray periodically that God would send her a companion in her work. Like she came to help Mrs. Lawson, she prayed that someone would come to help her. But God never sent that companion from the West. One day, though, Gladys was going down the street and she saw this woman that had jewelry all over her, and she had this little child with her that was very sick and starving, and she was just a wicked, wicked woman. So Gladys went down to the magistrate, the mandarin, and she said, we need to do something about this woman. She's out there with that poor child that's suffering. And he said, well, if you want to do something about it, go out there and do something. So she went back to the woman and told her how wicked she was, and reached in her pocket. She had 9 pence, which is just a few pennies. And she held her hand out to the woman. The woman grabbed it and ran away. And Gladys, the little girl, stayed with Gladys. The little girl's name was May N, and she became like a daughter to Gladys. She was nicknamed 9 pence because that's how much money Gladys had. And 9 pence eventually brought home a little boy who had less than what they had, and they took him in and they called him Les. So 9 pence and Les became Gladys's children. According to some records, it looks like she had 2 or 3 other children that she also took in that became actually part of her family. But this would start a ministry for Gladys where she took in unwanted or orphaned children and took care of them. And she started a school where she taught them to read and write and know God. Isn't that interesting? A girl that they didn't think could learn to speak Chinese also learned to read it and write it enough to teach other children. God really gave her special strength and smarts to do that. Well, Gladys did pray about everything. You know, remember, she learned to pray and she trusted the Lord that he would answer her prayers. At some point, she prayed for a man to marry. But no one from England ever came. And someone asked her, did God not answer your prayer? She said, yes, he answered my prayer. He called someone, and he must not have been willing to come. So she never had a man come from England to marry her. She lived a single life. However, she did meet Colonel Linen, who was a Chinese officer. And to her, he was very tall. They got to know each other, and he proposed marriage. She actually said yes. But in 1937, about the time she said yes, war broke out, and she knew that the colonel would have to go and fight in the war. So she said she would marry him after the war was over, and he left to fight. Well, in 1938, the war finally came to Yangcheng. Part of her inn was bombed, and she was buried in the rubble. Can you imagine how frightening that would be? The building falls down and you're buried underneath. They dug her out, and as she got out, she noticed something flapping in the breeze. And it was a paper that she had stuck on her wall in her room. It was her motto for that year. She had hung it up, and she had quoted 2 verses. God hath chosen the weak things. I can do all things through Christ who strengtheneth me. Because she's given up her British citizenship and become a Chinese citizen, she couldn't leave China, but she didn't really want to leave. There's a great quote that says, "These are my people. God has given them to me, and I will live or die with them for Him and for His glory." She really had learned to love the Chinese people that God had called her to minister to. Well, after this, after they dug her out, she went into town and organized the villagers to dig out the other people that were trapped in the rubble, to take care of the people that were wounded, and to clean up the debris. They had a wall around their city, and they never thought that danger could come to them because they had a wall, but that didn't protect them from the planes that dropped bombs from the air. So the local leaders gathered all the important people from the village, and they talked to Ai Weiwei about her work in the town and her Christian faith. Then he announced that he wanted to become a Christian. Can you imagine? This is a very important man in China. He decided to be a Christian. What a wonderful thing. What a great impact her life had had on this village. Gladys' story for the next few years now is stories about her fleeing danger and returning. She would have to run and hide in caves and then come back and minister to her beloved people. She cared for injured Chinese soldiers and tried to take care of the orphans that came her way. Once, while she was walking on the tracks to go to the cave hideout, because there was danger coming, the Japanese, because she had helped the Chinese and because she was taking care of Chinese soldiers, they wanted to pay somebody $100 to find her and catch her and bring her to the Japanese. And then they would who knows what would happen to her then. She knew there was money out. So whenever the Japanese got close to her city, she would have to go hide. So she was going to hide one afternoon, and while she was walking on the tracks to go to the cave hideout, she felt that there was some danger. She just felt uneasy, and she asked God to take care of her. About that time, she thought, well, God, help me know which way to go. And she felt like God wanted her to go up this really steep, rocky hill. So she climbed up that as best she could. It was rough to go up. And as she got to the top of the steep hill, about that time she heard the Japanese soldiers coming. Will she be trapped? Will she be captured? You'll have to come back next week.
Hey, boys and girls! Hopefully you had a great time tonight learning about the missionary story and singing some songs. Come back next week, same time, same place, Wednesday at 6:30. See you then!